Hi, Ray. How are you? Thank you for joining me. Looking forward to talking with you. He looks good, right, Rashad? Do you need me to tilt up or down? It looks like my head is off, but no?
I
So
don't know that he knows he's muted. I'll tell.
is that muted? I can understand everything he says. Is that muted? I mean, is that tilted up enough? Okay. Yeah, and yeah, you can just let him know he's going to stay muted.
Oh,
Oh, he can. Okay, you're going to stay muted, right? I didn't know he could hear us. Thank you. We're
hi,
gonna
Ray. Good to see you.
See, he said hi, Candy. Rashad, we are lip readers around here. I know. You're bad at fashion, you're bad at matching. You don't understand why I had to wear that shirt for 3 days. It is now in a basket, though.
Okay, I'm muting myself.
Passionate, outspoken, insightful. Ariva Martin is an award-winning civil rights attorney, best-selling author, legal commentator, and America's advocate. Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report.
Good morning and welcome to our viewers in the US and around the world. A recent study conducted by researchers at my alma mater, the University of Chicago, found the following. Blacks who work in corporate America feel marginalized, find it exhausting to be authentic on the job, are often overlooked for promotions, endure subtle racism at work, and remain virtually non existent in upper management roles, creating an unsettling workplace. The further you advance, the less minorities you encounter along the way. And in many workplaces, that means you may find yourself as the only African American in many organizations. Now, this same study found that Blacks represent less than 1% of Fortune 500 CEOs and only 3.2% of executives and senior management level employees in corporate America. Are these abysmal statistics and the phenomenon of being the only one about to change as companies across the country are publicly stating their commitment to diversity and inclusion in the wake of George Floyd's murder and Black Lives Matter led protests? Are corporate statements, "we stand with the protesters," refrains? Or are these refrains just politically correct platitudes made to appease socially conscious consumers? Or are companies really prepared to address systemic racism, discrimination, and toxic corporate cultures that are the hallmark of so many workplaces? Now, we're really today asking this question about companies. Today it's all about, are companies prepared to make the same sweeping changes that protesters are demanding for police departments? My guests today say it's put up or shut up time for brands and companies, for industries from as wide and as varied as Hollywood to Wall Street. My first guest is Ray Dotch. Ray is a television and media executive with more than 2 decades of experience producing some of the most successful talk, reality, news, and documentary shows on both broadcast and cable television. From Sony to Telepictures and Harpo Productions, and from ABC to CBS, OWN and A&E, Ray Dotch is an award-winning producer who knows what it's like to be the only one. Thank you so much for joining me today, Ray, for having this really important conversation at this time.
Of course, of course. Listening to you describe all I've done, I kind of impressed myself hearing that, but okay.
Okay, I read that resume. It's quite impressive. I guess we could say you the man as it relates to TV and producing and developing shows. And you've been the showrunner on some of the most successful shows that anyone has seen probably in the last 2 decades. So you have quite an impressive resume, but yet, despite that impressive resume, those really jaw-dropping statistics that I read also apply to you. You've been the only one in some of these very impressive and incredibly successful, super powerful workplaces. And I think for a lot of people, that's surprising.
Well, yes, more often than I'd like to count. There would be Black women sometimes, but I was typically the only Black man.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the things that has to be recognized is that when you are the only, then you feel the need to carry the burden of whatever racial situation that always comes up on your shoulders. And you're put in a position where you are oftentimes standing alone, trying to explain to the masses in the room, why this is important or why it needs to look this way or go that way. And since we're talking about the media and we're talking about speaking to the masses at large, you feel an even larger responsibility. At least I did.
And I know that you wrote a Facebook post, Ray, following all of the things that have been played out over the last couple of weeks. George Floyd's murder.
Yes.
We watched that excruciatingly painful, really execution of George as that police officer kneeled on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, played over and over again on so many, media platforms. But before I talk about you and your work experiences, I just wanted to briefly touch on that your family has been impacted by police violence. And
Yes.
you had to become the spokesperson for your family in that situation. Just tell us briefly what happened to your family member.
Yes, my brother-in-law was Keith Lamont Scott. My sister's husband was killed a few years ago by police officers when he was waiting in the car to pick up my nephew from school. He had a brain injury, and that was explained to the officers that he had suffered a motorcycle accident some months before and had not fully recovered. His brain was impacted and permanently impacted. And they were giving him instructions and things of that sort and weren't listening to his wife, who was yelling at them and saying he has a brain injury, he won't hurt anyone. And somehow he ended up killed anyway. I, being the only member in my family who was affiliated with the media, ended up being the spokesperson, where I had this unusual position of being the person on the other side of the camera. I mean, normally I'm covering that story. I am not necessarily in it or a part of it. And it just put me in this position of understanding for the first time what it feels like to be under those circumstances, but also in looking out. I mean, I think that you just showed a picture of the press conference there. I remember looking out at all of the cameras and all of the individuals who were shouting questions at me, and there wasn't a single African-American person there asking me a question about this particular very real issue that was going on around the country. And it said to me, they have no real understanding. They have no personal understanding of what it's like to be African-American, of being Black, and particularly male in America, dealing with this kind of situation. So they're throwing questions at me for the purpose of getting, the story on the air, and not really having an understanding of what it means for the actual individuals who are living and suffering through this kind of situation. It changed me as a producer.
I was going to say, Ray, so having had that very personal, again, my heart goes out to your brother-in-law and to your family, anyone who's gone through that. And we've watched it as members of the media, as well as just public citizens. We've watched how horrifying these experiences are as people or Black men are killed, unarmed Black men like your brother-in-law killed by the police. So my heart goes out to your family for that. But I just wonder, having had that personal experience and then watching what happened with George Floyd, what emotions did that invoke for you as an African-American male?
Well, it made me realize that, I can't tell you how many times I've walked into a network or production company or, a syndicator or any of these organizations, and I was the only African-American there. I was particularly the only African-American man there, unless, if you don't include the person sweeping the floor, parking the car, or standing guard at security. And it made me realize that over the course of the history of African-Americans, and particularly African-American men in this country, we have never been a part of shaping the narrative about ourselves. We have never been a part of telling our own story. So that every single person who's asking about George Floyd and all of the other stories and all of the other tragedies that have happened over the course of the last several years, they didn't have a personal understanding of what it actually feels like to have that experience. It made me realize that there's a responsibility that needs to come forward, where these individuals who are in positions of who have hiring power are starting to think and realize that they need to walk out into their newsrooms, walk through the offices of the production companies, and walk through the offices of the shows. And if there isn't an African-American man in the room, they are part of the problem. Because what that means is we aren't part of the narrative. We aren't part of shaping the story. And how can we now move forward in changing the narrative and getting things to look differently when we aren't even in the room?
So let me play devil's advocate for a minute, Ray. What would you say in response to those people that say, hey, there are African Americans who have been very vocal and very visible on these stories, and they would point you to Don Lemon on CNN. They would point you to Joshua Johnson on MSNBC. They would point you to Craig Melvin on NBC. What would you say to those people that say, hey, Black folks, you're only 8-9% of the population in the country, and on every major network broadcast or cable I turn on, there is an African-American male, at least anchor, that is telling these stories.
Don Lemon is a friend of mine. And all of those individuals who are on the air, I absolutely welcome that. But that's only a fraction of the process of putting stories on the air. They are not writing the script. They are not deciding the angle of the story. Their job is to be in front of the camera and to present the information once it's decided. How the story is put together, what stories are covered, certainly they have some influence, but it's not their job to determine what the angle is, what aspects are included, as well as we need to be a part of everyday conversation. We need to be a part of it on a regular basis. It can't just be just when we have a conversation where an African-American man is killed, or we point out 2 or 3, guys that are on the air and say, okay, we're covered in that regard. We're not in the room when the decisions are made about what does and what does not get on the air, meaning we are not telling our own stories. We have the mouthpieces and we appreciate those individuals and they do an extraordinary job. And without them, who knows where we would be. But it doesn't stop with just who's in front of the camera. We're doing a show right now and somebody reached out to me and said, hey, let's be a part of her show. Would you be a part of her show? You didn't do that. Somebody else did that. So I think that we need to be, and by we, I mean African-American men need to be in the spaces where those decisions are made. And that is the point I'm making.
Let me ask you this, Ray. Again, playing devil's advocate, how would the stories of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Tamir Rice, we can go down the list, Michael Brown, Eric Gardner, how would those stories be told differently if there were Black men in the room making those decisions that you just identified?
I think there's a narrative that exists that doesn't show African-American men as just being human. Rarely do you see or understand what it feels like to be Black and male in America. So while I can't specifically say, oh, this particular angle would be different or this particular situation would be different, let me just tell you, I've been pulled out of the car by police officers with guns pointed at me. I've stood there on the side of the road being wrongly accused or falsely accused of something. I've sat there with my hands, held behind my back and sitting on the ground, not knowing if a bullet is going to fly from any particular distance with police officers. So me telling that story with the emotion that goes along with that is different from anyone else who hasn't experienced that. It just is. And so when we aren't talking about George Floyd, when we aren't talking about Black men being murdered, but we're just talking about everyday conversation, Black men need to be humanized, because how often do you hear us express our emotion other than anger and frustration? When do you hear from us about us being thinking, feeling, emotional beings with dreams and goals? When do you hear that? When do you see that? And if you aren't in the room where the decisions are being made, where stories are being presented every day, then you're not going to see that. You're not going to hear that.
Well, you seemingly, Ray, in your career have risen to some pretty high levels. When I looked at your resume, you've been executive producer, you've been senior producer. So for those of us in TV, we know that those titles, at least the title, carries with it a lot of decision-making power, or should. So when you were the only African-American male at some of these huge production companies and at some of these, network television stations, did you have an opportunity to go to someone above you, above your pay grade, and say, look, I'm the only Black man in this room, and we can't tell these diverse stories. We can't have a diverse workplace while having only one Black man work in this organization? And if you did that, what was the response from the people above you, your bosses?
Of course I did that. I mean, I certainly didn't do that when I was younger because, first of all, let me explain it in 2 ways. Making that point means that when you make that honest, here's the situation, when you make that observation, what the white person normally hears is, you're racist. And so now you're dealing with their overreaction to you're pointing out the fact that you're the only one and they didn't notice. So now they're on guard. And now you're living and breathing and dealing with that day to day, because now they feel like you've either identified something within them that they didn't want shown, or you're either, or it's just such an uncomfortable situation that they then get defensive. Now, there have been situations where I have brought that to their attention. They did not get defensive, but they also didn't change anything. You know, I mean, I was left to be the person who was standing there carrying the weight of that on my shoulders, which should not just be mine. And the other piece is this: we're not monolithic. So it's not like I get to walk in and speak for all the Black people. You know, it doesn't work like that. So it's I always say it's akin to, if you're at the law firm, there's one Black lawyer. Or if you're at the architectural firm, there's one Black architect. You know, it's the exact same thing if you're the one Black producer on a television show or in a production company. It's the weight of that should not fall on us.
No, and you're absolutely right about that. And having worked in some of those large corporate law firms that you just described, I definitely understand what it is like to be the only one, or to be one of, you know, two or three, a handful in that situation, and the stress. And you're right. I mean, some of the cultural references, if you're an African-American woman, the main thing you're likely to encounter is someone wanting to touch your hair. You know, there's fascination around your hair, like, oh my God, what, you know, can I touch it? Can I feel it? And, you know, when the conversations come up about race, you're the go-to person. You're supposed to be the expert on all things, you know, race related, even though you may have an interest in this particular topic or not. But I want to ask you, help us understand from your perspective what that weight is. You talk about the weight. What does that weight feel like when you are the only Black man in one of these organizations, and you have, you know, all of this focus on you about, you know, being the Black person in the room? And even though you just said they may not have noticed it, I think I take exception with that. They do notice it. Now, whether they're prepared to acknowledge that publicly or do something about it is different. And the way we know that they notice it is because when you talk to people like you, what they'll typically say is, every time there is a diversity issue, every time there is a diversity conference or conversation, I get the tap on my door to be trotted out as the person representing diversity in those organizations. But just tell us what that weight is like. I really want people to feel that.
Well, I think that for me in particular, it's hard because we're talking about the media and we're talking about telling the story to millions and millions and millions of people, whatever that story is. So there's a feeling of, am I getting it right? There's a feeling of, am I representing properly? There's a feeling of, you know, why are you asking me? You know, I mean, you know, of all, you know, I mean, I get you asking me because I'm African-American, but why don't you know this already? And why are you making your desire or your decision to not making the hiring of African-American, particularly hiring of African-American men, your decision? Why are you making that now my issue? Why are you making that my problem to sort of fix, to pull you out of this situation? So it becomes this situation, and then you can't yell too loud, you can't argue too much, because then you're the angry Black man. So you are now trying to figure out how you're supposed to do this dance, answer these questions without there being ramifications, without people feeling, you know, it's sort of you're doing it in a way where you're trying to represent while also not trying to make them uncomfortable. Because making them—
let me ask you, did you have to work on shows where racism was a topic, and you felt like your job was to talk about race, but not make anyone feel uncomfortable about racism?
Absolutely. I did a show where, and I won't go into too much detail, but I did a show where we were discussing a particular prominent figure in the African-American community who was also controversial. And the individuals who didn't like him wanted us to attack him in this show. Even though the show wasn't about him, it just referenced him. They wanted us to attack him. And there I am, as the only African-American person in the production company and in the network that or at least working on this particular project, standing alone, trying to explain to them why it was important for us not to take this approach, why it was necessary for us to understand that while I understand and I get he has insulted these individuals over here and that should be acknowledged, we can't not acknowledge what he's done for African-Americans. And if you're saying that we have to make a choice where we are going to make the Jewish and the white community happy at the expense of African-American community unhappy, then take my name off the show, because I'm not going to stand for that. But the issue is that shouldn't have been the situation. That shouldn't have been a position I was put in, where I was sitting there trying to get people to understand that there's more to this than that's you. But what I think is we've gotten so used to not including African-American men as part of the story that it was foreign to them to even think about, let me consider these people too, which is all the more reason why there needs to be more than just me or the handful of African-American men in these spaces. Because if it's just us, then that means every day the narrative isn't being changed. It's not just about, as I was saying before, it's just not just about those situations that involve race. It's everyday conversation. And in those spaces where conversation and news is being had, us being there brings a perspective that is not otherwise been there.
So you've been around for a long time, Ray.
I'm sorry, I said.
You've been around for a while. You're a mature professional, right? You've got a lot of experience. You've worked in a lot of different places. You look fabulous. So this isn't a reference to your age. This is a reference to your experiences, and you've had some tremendous lived experiences. Are you feeling hopeful in this moment when you see the protests that are happening all over the world, when you see the diversity of those protests, and when you put the protests with what we are seeing now from companies? So you've seen it, you've probably gotten an email, like many of us have gotten emails, or you've seen these posts on social media where all of these big companies, including big entertainment companies, are standing with the protesters. They are committing to fighting racial inequities, wherever they find them. They're donating hundreds of millions of dollars to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, to the National Urban League, to all of these social justice organizations. Does this feel like to you a different moment where the experiences that you've had are about to change?
I don't know. I hope so. I really, really hope so. I think it's easy for a lot of people to give money. I think it's easy to put a press release together and say, hey, we're going to do something about this. But do I think that people even notice that we haven't really heard the truth from what it feels like to be Black men in America? I don't think that, no. Because I have for 3 or 4 years gone to all kinds of companies talking about the importance of this conversation, that we are viewed as disposable, that we are viewed as people whose lives are not valued. And the fact that that's the narrative is not even something that I think people realize to then put bodies in place in which to change. I think that when you talk about Black in America, you usually, mix Black and white, Black men and women together. And I think that the plight of the Black woman is uphill and difficult, but it's different from the plight of the Black man, because while women are dealing with misogyny, men are dealing with, we are scared of you. You are menacing to us. And so when you come into our orbit, our thought isn't, would you leave? Our thought is, go get my gun. That's the reality of what we're living with and dealing with. And then African American men like myself are supposed to get up every day, go out into the world, and pretend like that's not the deal.
This really pains me, Ray, because
Part that's not told. That's the part and the piece that is not included. And so if you don't know that it's not there, you don't know to look for it. You don't know how to grab it. You don't know to experience it. And nobody is asking the question of what it feels like, because the people who determine what the questions are don't look like me.
well, this really, I'm a mother of a Black son. I'm married to a Black man. I have, Black brothers, and this is painful. And it's painful because I see how passionate you are about it. And for anyone to feel like they are invisible, or less than, which is what you're describing, says we got probably more work to do than even we have articulated. And I think many people feel like there's a lot of work to do, but you're talking about work at a whole nother level. I mean, this isn't work that gets fixed by a piece of legislation in DC. This isn't work that gets fixed by, changing some police policies at a local police department. And that's what the conversation has been about, primarily, is how do we go in and fix these systems with new laws? How do we do more implicit bias training, more de-escalation training? But you're talking about how do we just cause people to recognize, the humanity of African American men. That's not a legislative fix.
Exactly. And the reason that it's such a big issue in the media, because we're the ones who shape the narrative. The media shapes the story. So I don't care how it came about that we're viewed as in the way that we are. I mean, I'm not arguing whose fault that is. I'm not even seeking to assign blame. I'm simply saying that in order for it to change, Black men need to be in the room where those decisions are made, period. As long as we're not there, nobody's going to think to seek to change it, because you are very well informed. You're very much involved. You just said you have an African-American son, an African-American husband, brothers, and things of that sort. But this, to some degree, is news to you, because there aren't spaces for Black men to express their emotion, to say, here's how I'm feeling. You get to see and hear us talk about how angry we are and how frustrated we are, but there isn't a spot where we get to say, this shit hurts. We don't get to say that. Nobody's asking us that. What does it feel like? And even in my desire and in my efforts to develop opportunities for that to happen, executives don't realize this isn't something that hasn't been heard. We're so used to not hearing it that we don't realize we haven't heard it.
So, Ray, let me ask you this, and thank you for making that as plain as you can make it. This shit hurts, okay? That hashtag that. No, that's a powerful statement. Where, if you could define your next job where you think you could have the most impact, where would that job be and what would it look like?
It needs to be in the spaces of it needs to be the Good Morning Americas of the world, the Today Shows of the world, the CBS This Mornings. It needs to be where talk is had. It needs to be CNN. It needs to be, Tamron, who doesn't have a Black guy on her show, to my knowledge, in the background. And I don't know that Candy Carter's doing a great job over there, but I don't know that there's a Black man included in that conversation. Kelly and Ryan, I don't know that it's included over there at any of the spaces where talk is happening. Because if you're talking about what's happening every day, then that's what needs to change. Because here's the reality. The reality is the narrative is what it is. And the idea that it only shows up in all areas of industry except for the police makes no sense. Their attitudes about Black men comes from the narrative. So then if we're changing the narrative, it needs to be where we talk every day. It can't just be, let's wait for the next Black man to get gunned down on the street and then talk. That can't be the deal. And our perspective is not included in those spaces because we aren't there to say to the people, hey, this is what an aspect of this particular conversation, whatever the conversation is, that's interesting from the Black man's perspective. And it's not even that it has to be from the Black man's perspective. It's just when you are putting together and you are producing through our viewpoint, it brings about something different that we haven't seen before because for the most part, we haven't been there. So we need to be in those decision-making spaces at the networks, cable and commercial, on television shows, meaning supervising producer, co-executive producer, executive producer, across the board, because then that changes the narrative, which then changes the attitudes, which then changes the behavior. Until that happens, white folks are still scared when I walk down the street. When the truth is, I should be scared of them.
I feel like a big job is coming your way, Mr. Ray Dotch. Lots of things happen for a reason. And I just feel like you're here today speaking truth to power and not calling out networks as much as raising awareness, because this is this moment in history where everybody's asking, all of our white friends are asking us, what can they do?
So my answer to that,
I'm saying to my white friends, they can do something really big and powerful, and they can make sure that someone like you, and not someone like you, that you, Ray Dotch, ends up on one of those talk show formats where people are, basically telling the narratives of everyday people every day. And like I said, not just when there's a shooting or there's something horrific that's happened, but these everyday conversations so that Black men all over this country can feel like they have a safe place where they can, talk about what it is like to be a Black man. And if we're going to get anywhere in this conversation, all of those companies that are standing with the protesters, that are hashtagging and posting the Black Lives Matter logo on their websites, what a tremendous opportunity they have to, walk the walk rather than just talk the talk. So I don't know. I just feel like something big is going to happen as a result of you being here, because you have such an important voice. You have such an important voice. And I can't imagine why those executives in these places, because you've worked everywhere, you have the credentials, you have the resume. So that's not even a question. So the question is, it's put up time, it's shut up time. It's time. One of my other guests who I'm going to be talking to this week says it's time to pull up. It's time to really pull up for some of these companies.
So what I say to those individuals in the industry is spend an afternoon or a few minutes today walking around your newsroom. Go into the production offices, go into the development offices, and see if there's a Black man there. Just see if there's there, because if they're not, then you're a part of the problem. That's something you can fix. That's something they can fix. And doing that, and then give the space where it needs to be more than just one, because like I said, when it is only one, then you wear the weight of that on you. But just be open to the idea that there's more to this conversation than just writing a check or than just saying the right thing or whatever. We need, as I said, incorporate it into the bigger conversation. And as far as me personally, I hope that I get to contribute in that way. But if it's not me, the bigger issue here is to ensure that our voices are heard across the board. That's the
irony of that. We talk about talk shows, there are tons of them. You mentioned Good Morning America and, CBS Morning, and obviously there are a ton of shows on CNN, MSNBC, and, tons of daytime talk from, Facebook shows to Nick Cannon has a new show coming out.
Nick Cannon has a new show, but his two executive producers are white.
Okay.
That's the truth. And that's not to say anything bad. I love Katie Davis, I love her, but that's just the truth. And so, you know, there is a part of me that's a little even uncomfortable saying and pointing this out because you don't want to necessarily be looked upon as the troublemaker. But the reality is you can't expect change of the narrative if we aren't there. And the only way to make that change is to bring that awareness. So I am a little nervous about this conversation. I'm gonna be straight up. That's just the truth.
No, it's nervous and it's uncomfortable, and it's nerve making for all of us who are willing to step into this space because we don't know. You know, people have been banned; they've had their careers ended because they've talked openly about some of these issues. But I can't help but notice the irony of having all, you know, when you think about George Floyd's murder and what his murder has done in terms of moving Congress and the U.S. Senate and even Donald Trump, you know, having these public pronouncements about how it's time in this country to really attack and address racism, and to think about having that Black man, his life be the catalyst for that, yet not having lots of Black men, not just one, but lots of Black men involved in telling that story. I've got to leave it there, Ray. This is such a, you know, powerful and empowering conversation. I just thank you for having the courage to step into this space and to share your story. And I wish you nothing but the best. And something tells me the best is really yet to come for you. And we're going to see you in some big places telling these incredibly powerful and important stories. So be safe out there, my friend, and thank you again.
I appreciate it so much. Thank you so much.
Wow. Yeah, these are hard conversations, and they're not for the faint of heart. If you're going to do the business of talking about race and change, you've got to be prepared to make some personal sacrifices. And sometimes that means getting yourself into places and spaces that are uncomfortable. My next guest did just that. He's Wendell Haskins, and he's the former director of diversity at the PGA. And currently he's the chief marketing officer of the Professional Collegiate League. But Wendell wrote an open letter critical of his time at the Professional Golf Association in response to the PGA's CEO and president's statements regarding the need to battle racism following the wake of George Floyd's murder. Thanks so much for joining me, Wendell. Good morning to you.
Thanks so much. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
So I know you were in the green room and you were able to hear some of the comments from Ray. Just what's your initial response to, you know, Ray's statement that this shit hurts for Black men?
Oh, it definitely does. And I can definitely empathize with everything that he said, because that's a common experience for Black men in corporate America and business settings. You know, it's really unfortunate that a man of his talent and experience is not working within his industry and can contribute.
Are you surprised though? I mean, I know you say this is common, but how common is it that you find, you know, stories like the story that Ray just told?
They're all too common. I mean, I'm not surprised. I have great friends in all industries, from banking to high finance to technology, sports, entertainment, and it's quite common across the board. And unfortunately, these are some of the things that we talk about, and there's certainly things that we hope to see change.
So I know you wrote a letter, Wendell. You were, I guess I'll use the word triggered by something the CEO and president of the PGA said as it relates to how they were responding in the wake of George Floyd's murder. What prompted you to write that open letter critical of the PGA and its diversity policies?
First of all, let me say this. You know, I love the game of golf. You know, I started something some 20 years ago to really bring diversity and inclusion and the importance of African-American history to the mainstream of golf. I started the original Golf Classic some 20 years ago because I love the game. It's changed the trajectory of my life, and I wanted to be able to share that with others to influence people to be able to play the game. There were a number of things that I experienced at the PGA of America and contributed that were quite honestly marginalized. And so when I saw the statements, you know, we were all waiting for the statements of the different sports organizations to put out concerning George Floyd. The PGA of America's statement was rather late, and when I saw it, they were just statements of empty platitudes, quite honestly, that, you know, we always experience, you know. So I was very disappointed. They were asking for comments. One of the pictures that they even used when they made the statement was something that I fiercely worked on independently, which was the relationship with Steph Curry, if you read that. And I was just about, cut out of that whole deal after initiating such great work. So when I saw it, Seth Wah and Susie Whaley are fairly new in their role. Seth Wah was not there when I was working for the PGA of America. Susie Whaley was a new president when I came in. But I felt like I wanted to share with them what my experiences were in hopes that they would understand, the nature of and the chronology of the series of events that happened that led to my departure.
Just briefly, what were some of your experiences, Wendell?
Well, I outlined the chronology of all of those experiences in my letter. When I went to the PGA, there were some things that I wanted to address immediately. One of them was the legacy of Charlie Sifford. And Charlie Sifford, for those who don't know, was the first African-American golfer to play on the PGA Tour. And he was a PGA member. And if you look at the history of, let's say, Jackie Robinson, which Charlie Sifford is considered the Jackie Robinson of golf. So in comparison, look how Charlie Sifford is treated in the golf industry in comparison to a Jackie Robinson, relatively obscure. And I knew Charlie Sifford. He was a friend of mine. I'd honored him at my own tournament some years ago. And I felt, this was something that would be a great opportunity for the golf industry to somewhat atone and recognize his contribution to American history and golf. So I pursued not only the Presidential Medal of Freedom for him, but also to be inducted into the PGA of America Hall of Fame. Through my network, I kind of spread the word to find out how I could get that done. My dear friend, who was a golf buddy of mine as well, Alonzo Mourning, was friends with Barack Obama. They played golf together. He asked Barack Obama if that would be, if he would consider that. Barack told him, this is exactly what you need to do. Tell your guy at the PGA of America to get a series of letters written to me recommending Sifford. And I did exactly that. So I received bipartisan letters from many of the most prominent African-Americans throughout all industries. And it was a great experience for me, certainly one of the most rewarding things that I'd done in golf. And I thought that this would be met with tremendous, tremendous love and honor internally. And unfortunately, when I went through the whole process, it was way more challenging than I'd ever thought it would be. And it was kind of diminished in turn. I mean, it was a great celebration for the world at large, but people didn't know what I was experiencing internally. That was really one of the things that was most disappointing to me. And lo and behold, Sifford did receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom, but he was not expedited into the PGA of America Hall of Fame at 92 years old, which is his own organization. So, he still had to wait to be inducted into the next class. And unfortunately, he died before then. So he was inducted posthumously. In my opinion, that's just a grave indifference to his legacy.
So we've seen these statistics, and I started the show, Wendell, talking about some of these statistics that, Blacks represent less than 1% of Fortune 500 CEOs and 3.2% of executive and senior management roles in corporations. And it's kind of hard to wrap your arms around and your brains around how, decades after, anti-discrimination legislation in the workplace, and laws that prohibited race discrimination, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, how it is that here we are in 2020, that you still have those really abysmal numbers when you look at Blacks in boardrooms, CEO positions, and senior level management. Help us understand. You've been in some of the biggest, corporations in this country, inside them, and as a diversity officer, they're working on diversity. Why are the numbers so bad?
Well, it comes down to the leadership. Great vision without great people is irrelevant. So the people that are making the decisions to bring these people on board really need to do a better job. They still control how the opportunities are presented to people and offered to others. So if they're not presenting the opportunities across the board, you won't see people in those leadership positions where decisions are made. I have some I have some great friends in high finance that are my golf buddies, people like, Bill Lewis, Ken Chenault, Bayo Malesi, folks of that nature. And, they'll tell you the same thing. I mean, Ken Chenault was quoted in something that you guys shared with me, that
Ken is the CEO of.
as talented as him that could be in those kinds of positions, but they're just not getting the opportunity to do so. And even at the PGA of America, when I went to work at the PGA of America and understanding how it works, which is essentially like a governance structure, there are 28,000 PGA members and only 160 of those members are Black. I mean, that's abysmal. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And those PGA members need a voice of their own to be able to speak to their leadership, to improve the culture of the organization.
But Wendell, can all of this be reduced to leadership? And the reason I ask that question is because, if we take that theory, if we take that statement as true, that is to say that there hasn't been any, enlightened or socially conscious leaders in any of these organizations for the last, 100 years. So is that too simplistic of an explanation for what's going on inside these companies?
Well, listen, you still have to work within the dynamics of the corporate structure when you get there. So it's not that, things will change within an instant. Just like, when I worked at the PGA of America, I thought it was going to be a great opportunity for change. Here I am, bringing all these great relationships, resources, introducing them to, people of color, particularly African Americans that want to contribute and have relationships with the PGA of America, and they just were not well received. So, there's, that systemic thing that you have to deal with when you work with inside these organizations to be able to get things done. And it's just extremely difficult. And when you're outnumbered, I mean, I was the only Black executive at the PGA at that time. So when you are speaking to people who don't have an understanding of even your culture or value some of the resources and people that you are bringing to the table, it's very difficult to make progress.
Yeah, and it's I don't know who else you could bring to the table. If you brought Steph Curry and Barack Obama, that's pretty much the dream of dream teams. Well, let me ask you this, Wendell.
And to your point, after doing that and seeing how I was treated doing that and the nature of that, I said, I don't know if I can do much better than this. Where do I go from here?
Not a lot of room up to go from Barack Obama.
My first year, I went all the way to the White House, and then later on, I go to one of the, arguably the most popular athletes in all of sports, and go to the finance committee and bring Dave Jones, who's a highly respected guy on Wall Street. I thought I had all my bases covered, but unfortunately, that wasn't good enough, or those relationships were somewhat usurped from me, or presented opportunities for other people to do with them what they like. So I don't know how I could follow up with that.
Well, let me ask you this, Wendell. For any white executive, company, brand that watches this show, and I hope there are many that do, what advice, like what one piece of advice would you give them to address this issue that Ray identified and that now that you've identified? All of these highly intelligent, highly qualified African-American men and women too. We're going to talk about women in some future shows, but we're focused on men today. What advice would you give that corporate executive that really wants to make a difference and make a change?
Find out who the critical thinkers are. Find the people who may have differences of opinion that can bring value to the organization. A lot of times people still choose people that they're most comfortable with, right? That are like-minded thinkers that may not have anything to do with race. I know in the golf industry, if you wanted to talk to me, I could tell you a number of people that would be great on golf boards, that would be great in golf initiatives, and would be able to support with critical thinking. They may not be some of the people that the golf industry are thinking about, but certainly they are there. Some of the people that I mentioned, like Bayo Malesi, who's on the board at Callaway, that's a great thing. There are people who are being recruited for the USGA executive committee, but you have to bring more people into the decision-making process and surround yourself with critical thinkers and allow them to bring other people into the conversation.
So we've seen, Wendell, lots of companies like the Lakers hiring a diversity professional. We know that Netflix hired its first diversity officer. She's actually a graduate of Harvard Law School. So we're seeing all of these companies at least saying we're taking this seriously by saying we're going to bring in someone whose sole job is to be a diversity professional. You've been a diversity professional. So tell us, one, are you encouraged by these companies that are hiring these, inclusion and diversity people? And two, what is that person's role? Because we hear these words and in some ways it's become like a buzzword. I don't even know if it has any meaning anymore. So help us understand what's going to change when these organizations bring in a diversity professional like yourself.
I think it varies. Diversity only works when that diversity executive has direct conversation and reports to the CEO, and that the CEO empowers him and trusts him to be able to execute diversity initiatives, and he has the full support of the organization, and people are held accountable. So it's great that these things are happening, but how much influence and power do these folks have? Sometimes it seems like it may just be checking a box so that they say they have these things. And, that's very unfortunate. The commitment has to be there from the leadership, and you have to empower these executives to make decisions and to be able to bring other people to the organizations besides themselves. Just because you have one person within the organization who has a diversity title and they're not able to recruit other people or to recruit talent, a lot of times people think that diversity executives can get these things done by themselves or with very little resources, and that's not the case. You still need resources, you need the backing of your leadership, and you need to be able to be a critical thinker and make key decisions to advance diversity and inclusion and empower people and to bring them into the economy of your business, because that's what it's all, that's really what it's all about. How do we get these people involved in the economy? Everybody wants to contribute and people want to participate in these economies.
So I'll just say my last question for you, Wendell, is how encouraged are you, again, when you see these big brands coming out, making statements like the PGA did, even though it was late, posting on their social media sites, posting on their websites, making long public statements about being self-reflective. I think the president of the PGA said she had to confront her own white privilege. And many of these executives are saying they're looking at their own privilege. They're looking at the advantages that they experience that they now recognize African Americans don't have, and that they are committed to change. They recognize that racism is a problem, and doggone it, they're going to change something. Are you encouraged at all? And I'm kind of being tongue in cheek about it because I have my doubts about it, but I want to know if you are encouraged by these, this prolific, it has been quite prolific, statements that we've seen by brands as diverse as, from the entertainment world, from the sports world, from finance. We've seen these statements coming from pretty much every sector in our economy.
Well, listen, I have to stay encouraged. There's always the possibility for things to get better. And when you do this work, you have to be committed to it and you have to stay encouraged. And I also said, I don't even work at the PGA of America anymore, but look at the impact that I'm having on golf. The whole golf industry has gone crazy as a result of this. That's because I'm truly committed to the work. The work is part of my purpose. It was not just my position at the PGA of America. And what I understand is that just as progress is possible, regress is possible. So we're still dealing with some of the same issues, even with the PGA of America, that they dealt with in 1990 with Shoal Creek. They reacted to something, there were racist policies at Shoal Creek and there was a big uproar. And that was how many years ago? That was, some 30 years ago. And now here we are in 2022, getting ready to have another PGA championship at Donald Trump's golf course in New Jersey, which could flare up similar sentiments that we felt in 1990.
So what was 1990, Shoal Creek? What was that for those of us that are not avid?
There was a big controversy at Shoal Creek because Shoal Creek in Alabama did not allow Black members. and the PGA of America was holding their PGA championship there. So people protested. So after that, you know, the PGA vowed that they would never hold championships that did not allow, you know, people of color or have diverse memberships. So that was an issue.
You're telling me now the Masters is planned at a Donald Trump?
It's not the Masters. It's not the Masters. It's the PGA Championship.
PGA Championship
The PGA,
is planned
PGA
at a
America-
Donald Trump property?
Excuse me?
You said the PGA Championship is now set for 2022 at a Donald Trump golf course.
Yes, at Trump National in Bedminster, New Jersey. The 2020 PGA Championship is going to take place there in 2 years. Yes, that's correct.
Wow. So what you just said, golf was in an uproar. I thought they were doing some radical things, like making some pretty radical changes. But as far as you know, they are going forward with a planned tournament at a golf course owned by Donald Trump. In the midst of everything that's happening in this country around race and the role that Donald Trump has played in terms of stoking racial division in this country, the PGA is going to host a tournament at his property.
Just as I said, just like progress is possible, regress is possible. So you have to pay attention to what's going on, the decisions that people are making, and challenge them. So
we're going to challenge right now. You and I are going to challenge the PGA president and CEO if they want to give real teeth to that statement about standing with protesters, because there's nothing that the protesters are protesting about that would allow them to support having a tournament at a Donald Trump golf club or property. So the challenge is you've got to do more than talk about it. You've got to be about it. And something really big, it could be symbolic, but it could have a lot of meaning, which is to move that tournament to a different property.
Well, I can tell you, I doubt that will happen. If you know anything about the golf industry, which, you know, a lot of people don't know the advanced planning that goes into producing a major championship. But
well, we just saw the president move a major rally because he, you know, ridiculously and stupidly planned it on Juneteenth in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So I don't think we should accept that a golf tournament that's happening a year from now couldn't be changed. Now, may be difficult, may be costly, but how do you start to give teeth? The minute we start giving excuses, well, you can't do it because it's too expensive, then, you know, where's the teeth to the statement? How are you battling racism? I don't get it. You can't have it both ways.
Those are questions that the American public and the PGA of America membership will have to answer to. That tournament.
We're raising the questions on the special report. Now, how they respond, like you said, they may say, oh my God, too expensive, too much planning has gone into it, too many logistical problems. And we say we call BS on that because the president can move a rally, a golf tournament can be moved. So that's
a decision that was made some 7 years ago to be at the Trump National Golf Course. So they're clear on.
A lot has changed in 7 years.
They're clear on where it's taking place. They've known this for some time, and I don't think there's any plan on changing it unless something very dramatic happens.
Well, something very dramatic is happening, and it's called millions of people taking to the streets and demanding that organizations like the PGA and others around this country start to really be about what they're talking about. And we'll watch, we'll see. May not change, but it won't be because you and I didn't have the conversation and at least issue the challenge to them to rethink that. And 7 years ago, the world was really different. So much has changed in the last 7 years, 7 months. And it's changing, continuing to change. And I think we have to continue to put pressure on these organizations that talk about wanting to challenge racism. It has to be more than an empty platitude, but we have to leave it there. Wendell, thank you so much for joining me today and having this critical and sometimes uncomfortable conversation. We're going to continue to watch what happens. Those of us who aren't even golf fans, now we're interested. So it's on our radar and we're going to be following it.
Story, hold people accountable. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure to be here. And these conversations aren't difficult for me. Everything has to be rooted and grounded in the truth. And I'm always ready to talk about that if we're starting from a place of truth. I appreciate you for having me on.
Fantastic. Thank you, Wendell. Be safe out there. Wow, okay. We're not big golf fans at the special report, but that doesn't mean we don't have an interest in holding organizations like the PGA accountable. Thanks to Wendell Haskin for putting that on our radar screen. And I hope my friends, I know my friends at Black Lives Matter and all the protesters who are hearing these big companies talk about their commitments are really going to be watching to see what these commitments to racial diversity and equity and inclusion really mean. Do they have teeth, or are they just fleeting hashtags? Thanks to my sponsors. Thanks to all of you for joining me today. Thanks to our incredible production team. Before I get out, I always leave you with some words to live by. Now, despite the conversation I had with Wendell and Ray, something does feel different about this moment. When you have millions marching in the streets all over the world, white, Black, Asian, Latinx people from all walks of life joining in protest and even taking to the floor of the US Congress to express now the world's most famous 3 words, Black Lives Matter. When that happens, you have to be willing to admit that something feels different. But it's probably too soon to know if this is truly a different moment. If this is a moment where we move beyond doing what's politically correct and popular on Instagram and Twitter to doing what we know to be the right thing to do and the profitable thing to do, because studies tell us that those companies that really embrace diversity, ethnic diversity, they do better financially. So it's not just about doing what's right, it's about doing what's profitable. And we know companies are in the business of profit. But history's replete with moments of big and bold promises of change and investments in the Black community. See, I lived in LA after the civil unrest resulting from the acquittal of 4 police officers who brutally beat Rodney King on video in 1992. The LA community just blew up. It went crazy. People were protesting in the streets for days, if not months, after that jury decision. And they weren't just protesting the decision, they were protesting a racist police department and structural racism that left Black and brown people left out of the enormous wealth of LA and California, which, by the way, California has the country's largest economy. And by world standards, we're like the 5th or 6th largest economy, but yet we have some of the highest poverty rates for minorities. And after the LA civil unrest, there were promises from every corporation you can imagine, government, nonprofits, industries far and wide came pouring in with big, bold promises. There were pledges to create jobs, invest in Black businesses, help Black families buy homes, and big promises to close the enormous wealth gap. Over $1 billion was to be invested in Black LA. And back in 1992, $1 billion meant a lot. I mean, that was huge. $1 billion to be invested. Now, decades later, historians report that a mere fraction of that $1 billion needed and pledged was ultimately invested in South LA. Buildings languished, burned down buildings. Nothing in the eyes of some people happened in South LA, or at least, I won't say nothing happened, but at least the promise of everything that was supposed to happen, the promise fell woefully short. And now, having lived through that period in LA's history and having been a part of some of those efforts, I remain cautiously optimistic at this moment. See, it's hard to move systems and to keep the pressure on in order to get to real change. 30 years ago, think back, we didn't have this 24-hour news cycle. We didn't have this hyper-partisan politics that we see played out every day. So imagine today how difficult it is for a movement to sustain itself, for it is to keep the attention of the nation. It was difficult in 1992. It's almost a monumental task in 2020. And you can just ask the family members of loved ones that have been killed by police, how difficult and challenging it is for them to keep the fight, to keep pushing for change after the glare of the media is gone. Now, see, it's those lived experiences that I've had and the history of race in this country that make me cautiously optimistic that Ray's experience, I'm optimistic that he won't be the exception and that he'll start to be the model for what newsrooms and TV industry should look like and what shows should look like, where there's not just one African American male, but there are many diverse voices, including many African American men in those newsrooms, in those production departments, in those positions of powers, helping to shape those stories that Ray said, and which I agree are so critically important if we're going to change the perception of how Black men are viewed in this country. And you know, it's inextricably tied to policing. If police see Black men as thugs and as criminals rather than as humans with emotions and as law-abiding citizens, we can't expect them to treat them as humans if all they see are these negative images of them. Y'all, this is hard work. But I tell you, the companies that are saying they are standing with the protesters, if they are really serious about change, they have the power and they have the authority to implement that change. And a real simple way, a simple thing that they can start to do right now, they can spend as much time looking inside their own organizations, as Wendell talked about, as Ray talked about. Just go walk through your own company, do a head count. How many Black men, how many Black women, how many people of color are inside your own organizations? You can start right now hiring and promoting more Black people. You can start right now changing that culture. You can spend the time making those changes internally, as much time on that as you're spending on talking about racism and standing with the protesters. And another thing I challenge corporate leaders to do, start talking to each other. Start talking to your fellow CEOs, your fellow COOs, your fellow managers. You guys have got to have these uncomfortable conversations, and you have to start challenging each other. It's not enough for the protesters or for Black Lives Matter or for Black female talk show host Areva Martin to challenge you. Your peers have to start challenging you. You have to start challenging each other to do something about it. You know, Nike's famous words are just do it. And I'll just add to that, this ain't rocket science. It's plain, it's simple. It's all about more commitment, more action, less words, and less hashtags. All right, y'all. I want you to be safe out there. Remember, we're in this together, and be back here Wednesday at 9 a.m. We have a great show. I go in depth with a real change maker. She is changing the beauty industry by calling them out and telling them to pull up or shut up. My in-depth interview with beauty CEO, beauty maven, beauty entrepreneur, and activist Sharon Shooter, right here on the Special Report Wednesday at 9 a.m. Bye, y'all.
We Can you guys hear me? Oh, when is this airing? I had people that were trying to tune into it. Did I misunderstand? So where do people see this? I had people tuned into the CNN, so I don't know where do they see it? Hello?
Wendell, I believe you'll be given a link that you